So we'll give everybody a little minute to get in. Welcome, everyone, to the first of our webinar series, Preparing for San Francisco, the 2026 annual meeting. I'm Lisa Seamus, Director of Communications at AAG. Today, we're really delighted to be joined by Dr. Deland Chan and Amy Zhu to learn about power, place, and organizing in San Francisco Chinatown. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Deland, and we'll get started.
Great. Well, welcome everyone, and thanks so much for being here. We appreciate AAG for the invitation to present this webinar. So we thought we'll start with some brief introductions and then outline the goals of today's session. Next slide, please. My name is Deland Chan, and I began my professional career as an urban planner working in San Francisco Chinatown with a community-based affordable housing developer. That experience eventually led me to pursue a PhD where my research focused on how Chinatown residents and members advocate for sustainable infrastructure projects. I recently returned to that organization as a director of research, and I'm excited to join today's webinar, bringing together these professional and academic perspectives.
And I'm Amy So. I'm an urban planner, and I was previously a senior planner at the organization that Deland mentioned, Chinatown Community Development Center. Not working there anymore because my work visa ended in January, but I am continuing to be a writer and researcher. I was also one of the co-founders of the LA Chinatown Community Land Trust and have done organizing in LA Chinatown, in addition to other Asian American organizing spaces in the Bay Area and across North America. So really excited to be here today. And what are the objectives for today's webinar? So we have three that we would really love to share with you. First is really Chinatown is more than just a tourist destination. It's a living, breathing location, neighborhood where there are over 11,000 people living in just a few square blocks in San Francisco. And it was once considered the densest neighborhood west of Manhattan. So you can think about all these people still living here, still shopping here, still doing business here. While there are a lot of places to buy labubus and tchotchkes, it's also the site of housing struggle, Asian American and US history, and a lot more. And second, we're also really hoping to place some of our walking tour, which hopefully some of you have signed up for or are on the waiting list for, hoping to place some of these locations in context. And then third, we really want to help folks understand the socioeconomic, political economic forces and really to think about how this neighborhood has come to be shaped physically through these multi-layered political and economic forces. The fate of Chinatown has never been created or crafted just in isolation, although that might be what people get an impression of when they visit the neighborhood for the first time. It seems very insular or self-contained, but it's actually been shaped by a lot outside of this community. So we're really excited to share this all with you today. And knowing that this is just a small piece of a much larger history, and we're really happy to talk about this a lot more as well. So just for some background and context for Chinatown, I'm not sure, I can't see the chat. I don't know who's been to a Chinatown before, whether it's San Francisco's or a local Chinatown in your own respective communities. But I'm guessing a lot of folks here have likely gone to one before, whether in North America or around the world. So Chinatown is a community. And San Francisco's Chinatown is full of people, full of residents who still live there. And up on the screen, I have this quote from an Asian American Legal Defense and Education Fund report, which noted in a few of the other Chinatowns that in Manhattan's and Boston's Chinatown in particular, the percentage of Asian residents dropped by over 20% over the past decade, despite an increase in overall population. And in Philadelphia, while the number of Asian people living in Chinatown stayed the same, the percentage of these Asian residents compared to the overall population of residents dropped by more than 13%. So I bring this up just to show that there are, in some other Chinatowns, due to a lot of external factors, a lot of displacement or gentrification, shifts in population. And while there are Also, a lot of pressures of gentrification and displacement on San Francisco's Chinatown. We've been pretty consistent in the percentage of Asian people who are living there. And so you can see that between 2013 and 2023, according to the American Community Survey, actually the percentage of the Asian population has stayed pretty much the same, around 84%. And just to give a little bit more context as well of the folks who do live here, Chinatown is also quite an older community compared to the rest of San Francisco. We can see that in the census tracts that we've delineated for the community. Almost a third of the residents are over the age of 65, and the median age in Chinatown is 54, which is compared to a median age of 39 in San Francisco. In addition, and I'm sure not a surprise to many of the folks who are here, I'm sure, over 3/4 of the residents in Chinatown are Asian. And a further breakdown of the Asian residents in the community finds that of these Asian residents, 81% of them are actually Chinese. And so this is compared to the proportion of Chinese residents to the rest of the San Francisco Asian population, which is just 21.3%, emphasizing that a lot of the folks who continue to live here in Chinatown are Chinese, and there isn't necessarily the same amount of demographic shift that we might see in other Chinatowns across North America. So, for example, in LA Chinatown, where I was doing a lot of organizing previously, we're seeing a lot more Latino population coming into the community as well. But we're seeing in San Francisco's, a lot of it has been pretty consistent in terms of a lot of the folks who are still there are of Chinese heritage. Mean and median income in Chinatown as well. The community, true to its roots, has maintained and remained quite working class. And you can see that reflected in the median household incomes in Chinatown, which in Chinatown is just 33,400. And when you compare that to the median household income in San Francisco, which is $141,446, like the comparison is quite stark as well. And finally, the greatest proportion of workers in Chinatown work in this arts, entertainment, recreation, accommodation, and food services category, followed by those who work in professional, scientific management services, and also followed by the educational, healthcare, and social assistance category defined by the NAICS codes. And it's worth noting that the proportion of residents working in retail trade is much higher in Chinatown than it is in the rest of San Francisco. So also a note on the housing stock as well. I talked a little bit about the folks who are living in the community. And when you all come to San Francisco in just over a month, you're going to look, if you come into Chinatown, maybe on our tour, maybe on your own, you're going to make a note of the actual building stock that's in the community. And the reality is that a lot of people are still living in these hotels, as they're called, that were built for itinerant workers in the 19th century. And these buildings have they're typically comprised of a number of smaller single room occupancy, SRO rooms, and some of them are just the size of some of them are just 10 by 10 feet, so very small. You can see in the upper right picture, a former coworker, Hazel, who has her arms extended to show what the actual width of these rooms are, and they're quite narrow. These rooms might have a sink, but the kitchen and the bathrooms are typically shared between a number of people, and many of these seniors live in these buildings and they appreciate the independence and the community that it provides, but families also live in them too, as you can see in the bottom right. This is Minyu Yu's family, was profiled in the SF Standard, and she has her husband, and I believe 4 children living together in one of these units. And they also have to share a bathroom and a kitchen with like the other residents who are on the floor. And it is like a small, cramped place to live. And a lot of people do choose to live here because the rest of San Francisco is quite small. The rest of San Francisco is quite expensive to live in. And finally, another small kind of contextual piece I want to add too, and just try to get a little bit of an image of while so many of us are not in San Francisco yet, is like how bustling of a community it is and how many small businesses are still there. This street that I've highlighted on the slide is Stockton Street, and it is a very distinct commercial corridor with over 100 mom and pop grocery stores, restaurants, herbal shops, family associations, churches, housing complexes, and in addition to some crucial social services like Chinese hospital, banks, and pharmacies. And it continues to make Chinatown an important location for diaspora around the region, so also in the rest of San Francisco and even around the greater Bay Area as well. I'm going to pass it to Delant.
Great. Thank you, Amy, for the contextual piece of present-day Chinatown. So I think to understand Chinatown as it exists today, I like to take us on a journey to look to its past and to consider its origins. And so the earliest Chinese immigrants to arrive in San Francisco were actually merchants, taking advantage of the burgeoning trade with China. Many were well educated, relatively wealthy, and most importantly, they had access to capital. They commissioned ships and they traveled to San Francisco, where they established their businesses at the edge of the waterfront that we now know of as Portsmouth Square. Next slide, please. Then, starting in the 1850s, the gold rush in California led to a much larger group of Chinese immigrants. These were miners and laborers arriving in the port of San Francisco, which became known as Gumsan or Gold Mountain, in search of the dream that they could come here, work hard, and send money home. Over time, many of these workers settled in the area that was known as Little China, roughly the area that we now think of as Chinatown. By 1890, more than 25,000 Chinese people lived in San Francisco, and it was a roughly an 850% increase since 1860. And I think it's notable that this group was different from the earlier merchants. They were mostly single male laborers. Many of them were returning from the Sierra Nevada, where they had worked in the gold mines or on the Transcontinental Railroad. And when they arrived in Chinatown, they needed the basic necessities: housing, jobs, and social services. Next slide, please. So this new group of immigrants quickly encountered the merchants and family associations that had been established by the earlier Chinese settlers. These groups supported the new arrivals who shared a surname or came from the same ancestral village. And so when they docked in San Francisco, the associations were essentially the first line of support to help the newcomers find housing and employment. The associations owned the buildings and businesses where the laborers lived and worked. And they operated these single room occupancy hotels, or SROs, which is the photos that Amy had shown, which are essentially dormitories with shared kitchen and bathrooms and designed to specifically support this population. And this type of housing remains a key feature of the housing stock that you will see in Chinatown today. Next slide, please. All this becomes important during the 1906 earthquake and its aftermath. The earthquake and really the fire that destroyed much of San Francisco was a turning point for Chinatown. Chinatown burned to the ground like most of the rest of the city. But what's often left out of the story is that the city had already made plans to move Chinatown. Just 2 years earlier, the Board of Supervisors approved the plan to relocate Chinatown to the southeastern edge of the city, or what is currently Bayview's Hunter Point. And so when the earthquake struck, city officials saw an opportunity to finally carry out the relocation plan. But Chinatown did not just accept this. Next slide, please. In response, the merchants organized quickly. They emphasized Chinatown's economic value, not just to the Chinese residents, but to the city of San Francisco as a whole. And they, in fact, threatened to move their businesses across the bay to the nearby city of Oakland, which would have been a huge financial loss for the city. One key figure is Bookton Eli, a financier who helped organize the merchants and pull together their resources. They actually hired architects who had never been to China to purposely rebuild Chinatown with these colorful building facades and these flared pagoda rooftops to signal an unmistakable, quote unquote, Chinese identity. As architectural historian Philip Choi writes, buildings like the Sing Chong and Sing Fat Bazaar, which you see in these postcards, are still standing today as evidence of the strategy. So I really want to emphasize that the buildings and ornamentation, it may all appear to be like a theme park version of Chinatown, but this physical appearance was a very intentional strategy and outcome. So what are some important lessons from this moment? First, it was a way for Chinatown merchants to leverage their existing economic capital to resist displacement. And it's only really worked because the merchants owned their property and ownership gave them the ability to act collectively and to resist displacement. Second, it secured Chinatown's permanence in San Francisco. And I just want to emphasize that this outcome was not guaranteed. Right? Many Chinatowns across North America did not survive similar attempts of removal throughout the 20th century. And so to conclude this portion, Chinatown's resilience after the 1906 earthquake has a lot to do with its pre-existing strong civil society from the beginning. right? You have these organized group combined with property ownership and coordinated response that really made a difference. And this history is core to the legacy of Chinatown and how we think about it today. So first, Chinatown is both a residential and commercial community, and it's a place that serves and is home to Chinese residents. We also recognize that San Francisco has been shaped by global forces like migration and trade, but also by local political and economic decisions. And then finally, its present and future was shaped by people who lived, invested, and organized there. And I think that's something that we can't really assume to be true for all Chinatowns. Next slide, please. So the next moment I want to focus on is the period of the Chinese Exclusion Act. Next slide. So the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed in 1882, and it was the first and longest national policy in US history to restrict immigration based on race and nationality, and it effectively barred immigration from China until 1965. As you can imagine, this had a profound effect on Chinatown. Immigration was drastically limited, and the population that lived there was overwhelmingly male, as I had mentioned, and then many of them were unable to reunite with their family for decades. Chinese exclusion was not just a US phenomenon. Other countries during that period enacted similar policies, including Australia's Immigration Restriction Act and Canada's Chinese Immigration Act. Particularly in the US, there were a few narrow exceptions. Merchants, again, especially those with capital, were able to sometimes enter and re-enter the country. And so that distinction mattered in terms of mobility and shaping who could move and who could not. Next slide, please. So what's interesting, though, is that even during this period of national restriction, Chinatown did not disappear from the political or global stage. And in fact, the neighborhood continued to be shaped by geopolitical forces. And I think one example of this period is Madame Chiang Kai-shek, who traveled to Chinatowns across the United States, including San Francisco, to raise funds and mobilize support for the Second Sino-Japanese War and China's war efforts against Japan. And these visits reinforced Chinatown's role as a transnational political and cultural space connected to global events that were far beyond San Francisco. At the same time, Chinatown leaders were organizing locally for neighborhood improvements. And I think an example of this is the Pingyun Public Housing Project. Next slide, please. So lobbying for federal housing funds began as early as the 1930s to improve what was seen as dilapidated housing conditions in Chinatown, exacerbated by exclusionary zoning policies in the surrounding wealthier neighborhoods such as Nob Hill. And although this effort had stalled during World War II, funding came through shortly after. And so on the opening dedication day of Pingyun, as you can see here, people completely flocked to celebrate what was seen as a really true victory of 500 new, modernized, and permanent units of affordable public housing. And this was really seen as critical and the legacy ensuring that Chinatown remained a residential neighborhood for immigrants rather than just becoming an only commercial or tourist district. So as a reminder, all of this was happening during a period when immigration was severely limited. And, even though immigration to Chinatown slowed dramatically and demographic growth was constrained during the Chinese Exclusion Act, the neighborhood was continuing to organize and position itself to receive resources. So to conclude, what this moment demonstrates is that leaders in Chinatown knew how to operate politically on multiple scales. Right? They were able to leverage global attention, national policy, and local organizing to improve housing and infrastructure. And despite what was basically a very deeply restrictive national immigration ban, its members did not see Chinatown as a disinvested neighborhood. And it continued to leverage political relationships, capital, and its position on the global stage to secure resources. Next slide.
Yeah, and that's a really good segue into a lot of the organizing and activism that we saw in the 60s and 70s. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how it specifically manifested in Chinatown and talk a little bit, especially about the student organizing and rising Asian American power and consciousness in the community as well. So The 60s and the 70s were moments of rupture for the Bay Area. We saw the emergence of the fight for ethnic studies across San Francisco State College, or, University, or college as it was known at the time, and also University of California, Berkeley. And we saw the emergence of multiple radical Asian American groups and some very historic tenant fights happening in this period. And to place this in context as well, this is all happening against the backdrop of Black Power protests, struggles across many different communities and global majority countries, thinking about Vietnam, Africa, Latin America, Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination, as well as recent policy shifts to enable more students of color to start higher education with increased financial aid and accessibility. And in relation to what Delanne was mentioning previously, with restricted immigration, we also think about as well the implementation of the 1965 Hart-Celler Act, which renewed immigration to reflect many of Chinatown's current demographics. And students, as they were enrolled in San Francisco State and UC Berkeley, started to build coalitions across multiple different communities of color, as well as including radical white students who supported their causes. As Harvey Dong and Michael Soldat and Enco notes, these activists, rather than necessarily having a fully formed ideology and political practice, borrowed from a lot of internationalist ideas that were formulating around that time, as well as local lived experiences. And this eventually led to strikes in support of developing third world curricula across these campuses and ethnic study departments at SF State and UC Berkeley. So there were coalitions of broader, to bring it back to Chinatown, there were these coalitions of broader Asian American groups developed in support of the San Francisco State College Third World Liberation Front strike, and they turned their attention to the conditions in their communities like Chinatown. And so young activists started these teen tutorial projects, youth advocacy, and marches calling out these socioeconomic inequities. And I have here on the screen as well some examples of some things that were produced in that time. So a poster from the Intercollegiate Chinese for Social Action, talking, bringing people in and supporting the youth, as I mentioned before, and then also a bulletin that they published about just centering and thinking through their community in Chinatown. And they said, Chinatown is a ghetto in San Francisco. There are approximately 50,000 Chinese, of whom the vast majority live in Chinatown. It is an area of old buildings, narrow streets and alleys, and the fluvia of a great many people packed into a very small space. At present, more than 5,000 new Chinese immigrants stream into this overpopulated ghetto each year, an area already blessed with a birth rate that is rising and will rise more. Tuberculosis is endemic. Rents are high and constantly rising. City services are inadequate to provide reasonable sanitation, and space is at such a premium as to resemble the Malthusian ratio at its most extreme. There are no adequate courses in any department or school at SF State that even begin to deal with the problems of the Chinese people in their exclusionary and racist environment. So they were really calling out for a curricula that reflected their personal lived experiences in their communities. And this also led to this very strong organizing that began in this period. These students who were part of ICSA became a part of the strong organizing base against, as one example of what I'm going to bring up, the international hotel eviction. And the I Hotel, as it was called, was home to 150 elderly Filipino and Chinese tenants on the edge of the Manila Town District, which actually does not exist anymore because of all the displacement that has happened. Manila Town is on Kearny Street, and if you go there now, you'll see Chinatown kind of begins at the other side of Kearny Street, and that there is no longer Manila Town, which originally was on the other side, was on the opposite side of Kearny Street. And it led to a protracted 9-year-long eviction fight that was led by the United Filipino Association and grassroots organizations like Asian Community Center, Asian Legal Services, and students from the Third World Liberation Front. They all came together in an attempt to stop the eviction, and it culminated on the evening of August 4th, 1977, where 3,000 people created a human shield to resist against 400 riot police who forcibly removed the seniors in the building. And while the resistance was unable to stop the eviction, this international hotel fight became a touch point in Asian American and Chinatown history and guided much of the housing organizing that took place over the next few decades.
The next moment I want to focus on is the 1989 Loma Prieta earthquake, where once again we see how a natural disaster and crisis created an opportunity for Chinatown. Next slide, please. So for context, the Embarcadero Freeway was built in the 1950s, and its off-ramps were constructed next to Chinatown, which I might add was an improvement over other cities where the freeway directly bulldozed into Chinatown in Boston, Philadelphia, and so forth. And even before the earthquake, environmentalists and urban planners had been calling for freeway removal. At this particular moment across US cities, there was a growing movement to demolish urban freeways that had cut through inner city neighborhoods and reinforce environmental and social inequities. And so the Embarcadero Freeway was essentially already part of that conversation, but the 1989 earthquake essentially forced the issue. After the earthquake, the freeway was severely damaged, and the city had to decide whether to rebuild it or to demolish it entirely. Next slide, please. Oh, next slide. Yeah. So Chinatown merchants quickly, please go back. The Chinatown merchants quickly organized in support of rebuilding the freeway. And from their perspective, it was a critical connection between the waterfront and Chinatown, bringing customers, goods, and economic activity into the neighborhood. Despite all of this organizing, they ultimately lost that battle and the freeway was demolished. Rather than stopping there, Chinatown's leadership then pivoted. Merchants and community leaders began advocating for public transportation instead. And they recognized that if the freeway was gone, Chinatown needed another form of infrastructure to stay connected to the rest of the city. At the same time, there was growing federal interest in funding urban transit projects, especially light rail and subways. And through that, Chinatown merchants saw an opening. The Chinese Chamber of Commerce, along with social services organizations such as Chinatown Community Development Center, sent delegations to Washington, D.C., where community members testified and essentially pushed for federal transportation funding that would benefit the neighborhood. This effort did not produce immediate results. In fact, it took decades. Next slide, please. So the Central Subway is an outcome of nearly 30 years of sustained advocacy that began in the 1990s. Today, the rose-packed Chinatown station at Stockton and Jackson Street stands as a reminder of that long, sustained campaign named after one of Chinatown's civic leaders. And so this moment matters because once again, we see a highly organized civil society in Chinatown advocating at the federal level to leverage infrastructure investment. And groups representing economic resources, especially merchants, played a central role. What's particularly different is who has joined them, right? So merchants and family associations are now working alongside these newer social service organizations, many founded by the activists that were influenced by the civil rights movement. And they often operate with a different political language and set of tools. And so this alliance between the kind of traditional organizations and social service groups becomes a defining feature of Chinatown's advocacy moving forward. And just like in early moments, crisis did not weaken Chinatown. It activated an already organized community that knew how to strategically adapt and leverage various opportunities. Next slide.
And finally, just for like this last touch point in a moment, I'm going to touch a little bit on the current issues and the things to be thought through of the Chinatown in the present. I'm having issues. Here we go. So I showed you this photo a little earlier in the presentation of Miyu Yu and her family. And we're at the present moment where multiple forces of displacement and crisis have been striking Chinatown and so many other communities, working class communities of color. Over the past decade, we've had former housing advocate and lawyer, Mayor Ed Lee, take power as the mayor and enable tax breaks that ultimately allowed for the influx of wealthy white tech gentrifiers into the city, particularly around the south of market areas, raising rents, displacing many of San Francisco's generational Black and brown residents and contributing to over-surveillance that has directly led to the murders of San Francisco residents by police. And there's been, I really want to shout out really great work done on this by the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project, Dr. McElroy and Dr. Manissa Maharawal, and many others. The COVID-19 pandemic as well was an extremely difficult time for many members of the Chinatown community due to the shutdown of workplaces and businesses, both in the neighborhood and outside of the neighborhood where residents might be working. But also, as I mentioned before, showed you that picture of the person who had her arms extended in the SRO unit. And a lot of these units are very small. And so when social distancing came about, many of our community members were located in these single room occupancy units, making social distancing very difficult, in addition to making it difficult for children and families who might be living together in these cramped quarters for them to actually go out and actually be in other public spaces. And they would have to do everything in these small rooms. They would have to take schooling, etc. And being unable to go outside was incredibly difficult for these families and for children living within the units. Around this time, there was also the rise of the Stop Asian Hate movement, where violence against Asian Americans was noted amidst the attribution of COVID-19 pandemic to the community. And this also led to increases in this law and order rhetoric among more conservative parts of the Chinese American community and broader Asian American communities, including in Chinatown, but also in the rest of, I'm sure, not just the Bay Area, but around the country as well. Many of these folks and this movement itself proliferated in Chinatown and created, opportunities for community care and thinking through what community safety looks like, but also in supporting greater movements around law and order, both supporting law and order candidates, but also the recalls of progressive electeds like District Attorney Chesapeake. And finally, there are a number of austerity budgeting coming. There's a number of austerity budgeting coming from the new mayor's office, Daniel Lurie, which has led to proposed cuts in a variety of frontline serving programs, including youth programs, building code enforcement, which is necessary in communities like Chinatown, where buildings are over 100 years old, and arts and culture programs. The San Francisco Municipal Transit Agency, MUNI, faces a deep fiscal crisis and is threatening to cut lines, including many of those that extend deep into Chinatown. And a recent upzoning plan passed in San Francisco that increased the density of many parts of the city, including the West Side, North Beach, and other parts. And while it doesn't necessarily touch Chinatown, as you can see in this map, many organizers and advocates have said that simply changing zoning will not actually do anything to create more housing to address any of the affordable housing shortage that there actually is in San Francisco. As a report from People Power Media shared recently, the city has actually been overbuilding housing that most San Franciscans cannot afford. And with the increase of the density now, it seems that this will continue to be an issue. Much of the housing that's being built currently and that is planned to be built is actually out of the reach of affordability for a lot of the folks who are living in neighborhoods like Chinatown. And so while there is, a lot of emphasis on deregulation to improve or to invite more development, the type of development that is being proposed isn't actually, even if it's called affordable, not really, really affordable for the folks who really need it.
Great. So I'd like to close with a few high-level takeaways. Across these movements, we've seen how place-based organizations, which are groups rooted in the neighborhood, know how to organize, leverage capital, and shape the physical environment, whether it's through housing, architecture, or transportation infrastructure. We've also seen how these organizations have responded to both local and external forces, so natural disasters, national immigration policy, geopolitical events, and shifts in federal funding. Throughout all of these movements, Chinatown learned how to work with them and at times redirect them to serve the neighborhood. I think it's also really important to conclude and emphasize that no neighborhood community is monolithic, right? And certainly not Chinatown. There are multiple internal interests and factions. But what's striking is that in spite of those differences, this community has repeatedly found ways to organize collectively and work together where it matters most. So if there's one thing we hope you'll take away, it's that when we look at neighborhoods such as Chinatown, we should pay attention not just to what they look like on the surface, but really underneath in terms of who's organizing, specifically who controls the resources and who can actually turn community priorities into physical change. So from this webinar, we may conclude that Chinatown is unique, but we think that the way that we've been looking at it doesn't only apply to this specific community. And perhaps the same lens here can help us to understand and examine other neighborhoods and other places. So if this webinar has sparked your interest, please join our walking tour next month during the AAG conference. Being in the neighborhood and seeing all of these places in person will really help to bring these stories to life. And so with that, we are happy to take questions.
Thank you.
Yeah, we'll give everyone a chance to absorb the whirlwind 100 years that we've been through. But one of the questions is, where can we find the walking tour details? And maybe I can turn that over to AG or Amy.
I think Ellen responded and says to join the field. Oh, the wait list. Please email meeting@aag.org.
Yeah, so the field visit is code FV2-5, and you can view that through the online session gallery. It is currently full, which is very exciting, but there is a waiting list. There are about 5 people on the waiting list currently, but waiting lists are quite fluid. So as people solidify their annual meeting plans, things change. So do feel free to reach out to meeting@aag.org and we will get you added to that waiting list.
And I see
Okay.
a question. Oh, sorry. I was just going to read out sharing more about the Embarcadero. I think you mean the Embarcadero Bridge and the outcome, and surprising to hear that the community wanted to rebuild it.
Sure, I can speak to that. So it's interesting when you look at some of the historical documents around that period, is that there was kind of a split between the environmentalists and urban planners who wanted to tear down their freeway, and then the Chinatown community who really saw their freeway as bringing in a critical kind of connection point for commerce into the neighborhood. And so it's just really, it was I guess, different priorities and kind of trying to understand what would be really critical to the Chinatown community as a lifeline. So I think for the Chinese merchants and those who really value the freeway as a kind of economic lifeline, they saw it as really important to rebuild it. I also see a hand from Wei Li. I don't know if you want to unmute yourself and speak.
Okay.
Oh, I think you muted yourself again, Wei. I can't. You heard a noise and then didn't hear anything else.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, so I'm just wondering if you can comment on the recent or the current immigration rate and the impact of Chinatown. I recall San Francisco City were able to avoid ICE surge a few weeks ago. I'm just wondering what's the current situation and overall impact. Thank you. Again, thank you for this webinar. It's really helpful.
Emily.
Thanks.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's a really good question. And I was also thinking about whether or not to put more in there about that. So you mentioned that yes, there was initially supposed to be oh my God, a surge, an enforcement surge is the wording that they used. But it was called off. I think the only city so far to have been called off for it because Daniel Lurie, our billionaire mayor, I think was able to have a conversation with Donald Trump. And I think there's actually been some conversation on the ground with grassroots organizations around like trying to actually reveal what the context of that call was, because that wasn't revealed publicly and folks are a little bit curious as to like what exactly happened. But there is of course like the enforcements have never stopped. Like they were continuing before and they're continuing after. And actually just down the street from Chinatown is two of the immigration courts in San Francisco. And they have continued to, maybe not in the last month because of a halt imposed by the Superior Court in Northern California, but there were frequent kidnappings that happened of asylum seekers who would come for their court hearings at immigration court and then have ICE agents outside waiting for them, as we've seen in other places. And I don't know if anybody here follows football. I don't, but I do know that the Super Bowl is happening this weekend, and there have been a lot of conversations. There have been a lot of rumors, a lot of folks talking about how there seems like there is going to be increased enforcement or increased agents that are coming. And I think, folks on the ground are preparing to see that happening. I think there's been a lot of like organizing from nonprofit grassroots groups. I don't believe, and I hope that I'm not wrong, I don't believe that there's been any like explicit raids in Chinatown. Maybe Deland, you might have heard differently, but we've definitely seen some other ones in other Chinatowns. Like New York's Chinatown has been hit a few times. But I don't believe that there's been any in San Francisco Chinatown explicitly, but these raids and I think these kidnappings have continued. They happened before the surge and then they've continued after, even if it wasn't like the huge amount of ICE agents who came into the city and the region. If that helps. So Ian asks, do you know what happened to the residents of Manila Town? So after Manila Town, unfortunately, that initial displacement, a lot of folks ended up moving to South of Market, and that became kind of like the Filipino town in San Francisco for quite a few decades. There's like a lot of really great cultural groups, Soma Pilipinas, that are all around the area. But unfortunately, that area was the site of a lot of very intensified gentrification with what I mentioned before, like the Twitter tax break and a lot of the tech gentrification specifically targeted as well Soma. And so a lot of folks like moved to a lot of folks who were in Manila Town. Uh, a significant number of the community moved to Soma. And I think also since a lot of the folks in the International Hotel, like I mentioned, were seniors, I think had to find housing elsewhere as well. Now, specifically speaking to the International Hotel, it took many years. The developer, who was an international Thai businessman, so I think there's actually a lot in there about like international financial capital or racialized financial capital as well. After he ended up buying the building, evicting everybody, they just kind of left it for many years. And for many years, it was like first just the building was left there, and then it was demolished, I believe, for many years as well. And then eventually, I think in the 2000s, it was built back up as like an affordable housing project, and it's actually now run and operated by Chinatown Community Development Center, which is where Deland works and where I previously worked as well. And there are some original members of the International Hotel, residents of the International Hotel, who now live in that building, as it is now like formal affordable housing. So yeah, I think a lot of folks moved from Manila Town to Soma. Deland, was there anything else you wanted to add?
I don't think so. I mean, I believe there was a first right to return, like when the building opened. I think there was an effort to try to find the original residents to offer them affordable housing at the International Hotel. And there's also really interesting history in terms of the height of the building and how it was actually able to be constructed. I think there was some air rights purchasing from the nearby buildings. And so if you go to that particular block, there's the City College North Beach Chinatown branch. There's like a school in the middle, and then there's the International Hotel at the corner, right at the edge of Chinatown on Kearney Street. And so you can sort of see that blending of the fabric of financial district a little bit further to the east, and then Chinatown is really to the west. It's a really interesting block. Yeah, so Gina had a question around current organizing in San Francisco's Chinatown, especially in terms of coalition building across racial and class lines. And I know, Amy, do you, I feel like you might want to speak to that.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and there's so many different ways to approach that as well. I think um we can definitely talk offline about this too, because I saw that you had sent an email as well. But I think like so a little bit okay. I moved to the Bay Area from from LA, where I was doing organizing in Los Angeles, Chinatown. And I bring that up, and I also bring up the fact that I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, which is that there are a large percentage of Chinese and Asian American people who live in Chinatown, where I bring up that like differently from some of the other Chinatowns across North America, San Francisco's had stayed quite Chinese and quite Asian. And like compare and contrast that to, for example, like LA's Chinatown, which like I mentioned before, is like there are a lot more Latino residents who are moving in. And I think there's like a greater dynamic as has been researched by great folks like Wendy Chang about Latino Asian like mixed neighborhoods, suburbs in places like LA. And that's not really as present in San Francisco, where it's like there are a greater melding of different communities of color in San Francisco's Chinatown. Um, and as a result, and also I think like in San Francisco as well, just like the political power of Chinatown has been very strong for many decades. And that didn't just come out of nowhere. It was like a lot of organizing of seniors, of residents, a lot of like building, relationship building, and consistently like going to going to actions, creating actions. And I think like I bring that up as well as like Chinatown itself is like a great source of like political power in the community. And I think it is now pretty consistent that like if there's ever an elected who's trying or a potential elected who wants to run for office, they always like come out to Chinatown and make sure they do their little meetings or the little photo ops with like the aunties and the seniors who are involved with the Community Tenants Association, for example. So I bring that up. I bring that up in terms of like situating Chinatown as a place and like the situating Chinatown as like this political entity in this place. And I think that there have definitely been some organizing with like other kind of like nonprofit coalition groups, I think in places like the Mission, um, which is like a predominantly Latino neighborhood that has been hit really hard by gentrification, and occasionally also like Hunters Point as well, Western Addition, which is like where a lot of the Black community in San Francisco lives. I've seen like a lot, some like advocacy coalitions where it's like, oh, they'll band together and then maybe also have conversation, like band together in a coalition to, advocate for a certain pot of funding or something. And this is particularly from our lens, Deland and I, as like previous staff of like a nonprofit organization that was like, to be quite frank, considered quite powerful in San Francisco. Um, but I think that yeah, I definitely think that there's like a lot like the Chinatown's positionality as like this very powerful kind of political entity. It's very interesting and unique and a little bit different than like some of the other Chinatowns across North America in terms of like what it actually means in terms of like coalition building um and searching for power together. I don't think this quite answers what it is that you're asking, but I think that is like a really interesting question. Delanne, was there anything that like you wanted to share about that?
Yeah, I did want to add that, well, CCDC is part of some national and statewide California-based coalitions as well that I just wanted to mention. So there's the National Coalition for Asian Pacific American Community Development, or National Capacity. And there's a really great annual conference and a network of other kind of community-based developer organizations kind of sharing resources and understandings about how do we kind of do place-based development work, which has a very kind of specific intention and kind of mission around that. More recently, we've been trying to expand our capacity for California-wide organizing around particularly like housing issues as well. And so we have a group that does meet, encompassing groups from the Bay Area, along with some of the groups from the Mission that Amy had mentioned, the Tenderloin, but also in Los Angeles, San Diego. And we're also hoping to move actually to grow our kind of coalition to the more rural parts of California as well, so that we can really see how we can, yeah, promote our kind of shared community priorities.
Yeah, I
Great.
see. Oh,
Go ahead.
sorry, go ahead. I was just gonna read Kim's next question about publishers who create a website. I don't know about this in particular. Um,
I think
oh,
it's a great idea. We do hope to be publishing more of this in scholarly channels in the future. Thank you.
yeah. Yeah, and then Guo Chen says, can you talk about the diversity of Chinatown residents besides Chinese and also the generation-wise breakdown, first versus second and third gen? Anything unique for Chinatown and community organizing and compared to other communities in SF? Yeah, a lot of questions. A lot of really great questions. I can take a stab at it, and then do you want to go to land after? So I think the diversity of Chinatown residents, besides Chinese, so well, like I said, a lot of them are actually from the Taishan area of China. But there are increasingly some more Mandarin speakers as well. Like when you go in, like I can speak Mandarin to people. Um, but I think that there are also like Pingyuan, which Delanne mentioned, is like a public housing building. And so there's a fair amount of, in addition to Asian folks, there's also Black and brown folks in the building as well. And also some white folks as well. Because the public housing is, like it's public housing, it's like city housing. Um, it is open to everybody technically, and so there's in these large buildings like that, there's typically like a much bigger like um demographic spread of folks who are in there. And then generation wise as well, like I would say a lot of the folks who live in Chinatown are typically like first gen and older as well. Yeah, they're mostly first gen. And I think we have thought folks within Chinatown have like frequently called San Francisco's Chinatown like the gateway um for newcomers, because a lot of the time back when San Francisco was not nearly as unaffordable as it is now, um, a lot of folks who were coming to the US for the first time would come and live in an SRO in Chinatown where they were kind of, getting their feet, getting their awareness of like what's around them, and then would move out elsewhere, or they would save for a few years. So they're living in like an SRO in Chinatown. Now, because things are so unaffordable in San Francisco, they come in and they just end up staying for years. Like they can't actually move out anymore. So most people who do live there are first gen. A lot of second and third gen don't necessarily live in Chinatown, but they'll live in like the west side, so like in Richmond or Sunset. And they'll typically, like I have a lot of friends who, like, for example, their grandparents lived in the Penguins or their grandparents lived in Chinatown, but they grew up in the Sunset or in the Richmond or other parts of the Bay Area. Um, I'll just answer the second one as well, and then maybe Delaney, you can also go too. I think like anything unique for Chinatown and community organizing compared to other communities in SF, I think I touched on the fact that like the Chinatown in San Francisco has a lot of political power. And I think as a result, it has like a large amount, like it has the Community Tenants Association. It is really well organized. And so, not that folks in Chinatown are able to win everything, but I think that there have been a number of like housing struggles, like a number of for example, like subsidies that are fought for that I think folks are actually able to win. And there's also like a proximity to, I think, like folks in power that maybe a lot of other communities, not just in San Francisco, but in other cities, like don't necessarily have to their politicians to land. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think those are all really great points. A few things I might add, just in terms of implications for community organizing, is just I think density has a lot to do with the ability to organize people in place. So just keeping in mind, like, if you were in the suburbs or in the exoburbs, a lot harder to actually have gathering places for people to organize. And so the traditional methods of having town halls or kind of going door to door or that face-to-face contact will really change depending on just density, transportation options, and so forth. And I also think, just speaking from personal experience, having spent, being born in New York City and having spent a lot of my time there, is just language, right? Like in San Francisco's Chinatown, Taishanese and Cantonese, I think, are kind of the main dominant dialects. You might have some Mandarin speakers here and there, but really in New York City's Chinatown, it's very noticeable that the population that moved into Chinatown, New York City's Chinatown around the 1990s, spoke Fujianese and kind of like other dialects. And so I think it's really just telling in terms of, the areas of immigration in terms of where the Chinese immigrants were coming and how that changes the dynamics when you have different ancestral villages and backgrounds and things like that. Great. Let's see if we have time for a few more questions. Maybe this could be the last question if I don't see anything else. For those of us in San Francisco, are there any local community organizations you recommend whose work we can support? Ooh, where to start?
Did you just say you wanted to start? You should start.
Oh, I don't really know where to start. I mean, there's kind of depends on skills, interest, right? And how much time and duration. I think for me, I always start with just awareness and understanding, right? So taking the time to kind of learn the history of the community, kind of read the scholarly works that are out there, read what has been written and what has been kind of produced by the community is a really great start to support this work, right? Just understanding that background and history. I think also just being open in terms of your presence. I mean, I'm sure there's like volunteer opportunities at various scales that you could participate in. But I think, yeah, the first step I recommend is just self-awareness and self-education to kind of understand like how you're coming into a particular community. And then maybe Amy has some more concrete suggestions.
Yeah, I just posted in the messages the SF Anti-Displacement Coalition, which I think does like really great work for tenants in multiple different communities. So I think I would really suggest them. And then I think you could probably see like on their work like who else they're in community with as well. So but I think that they do great work. Um and also, yeah, I think it's like also regardless of wherever you are, like with everything going on, I'm like, this is the time to get to know your neighbors, get to know your community members, get to like plug in and see what's going on around. Um, so yeah, I know I see Lisa's popped back up, so maybe that means our time is up. And please, yeah, we can drop our emails in the chat in case folks wanna.
Yeah, by all means, we don't have to
Yeah.
close the actual session. So you can, if you would pop those in, I think people would really appreciate it. What an amazing talk today. Thank you both so much for giving us your time, and sign up for that wait list for the tour, and we'll see everyone at the annual meeting. Thanks to everyone for your interest in today's webinar, and we'll see you again. We'll keep the window open just for a few more